and thank you for joining. My name is Derek Kane, and today we're going to dive into the topic of machine learning and genetic algorithms. This presentation is just one presentation in a series of lectures diving into topics of machine learning, predictive analytics, statistics, and artificial intelligence. Okay, let's begin. Charles Darwin has stated, "It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change." And this is an amazing idea when you think about it. And how can we relate this concept in a machine learning context? Can we use it in our predictive analytics? So the focus of this presentation really is going to be diving into that topic. But to first move into this, we have to have an understanding of what a genetic algorithm actually is. We have to also have an understanding of the inspirations that we see from biology and from the natural world. Then we need to move into the concept of evolution. Evolution in both a biological sense and also in a machine learning context. Once we have these components, we're going to get into the actual mechanics of the algorithm. So how can we create a genetic algorithm from start to finish? And we'll go through a very basic example that kind of explores, how to do the encoding, the mutation, and all of those aspects. Once we have this really well defined, we're going to get into a series of practical applications. And traditionally in my lectures, I only do one application. I think it's important with genetic algorithms that we look at a couple different variations of it, just so you can see how powerful these tools are and actually know how to use them in practice. So the first one we're going to go through is the Knapsack Problem, or a constrained optimization problem, if you will. Then we'll move into a topic of feature selection for regression models, or selecting the right variables to use for a given task. But we're going to use genetic algorithms to perform this feature selection. And then finally, we're going to dive into the topic of a traveling salesman problem. And I'm giving my own spin on this. I mean, this is a classic operational problem, but I want to show how we can use R and how we can use a data set very similar to what we'll see in the real world to tackle this problem. So I think this is a very good problem to look into, and I hope you find some value in it. Well, what is a genetic algorithm? A genetic algorithm is an adaptation procedure based on the mechanics of natural genetics and natural selection. Genetic algorithms have two essential components that make them up. They have what we're calling the survival of the fittest, and we'll get into this topic a little bit down the road, and genetic diversity. The concept was originally developed by John Holland in 1975, and the genetic algorithm is a search heuristic that mimics the process of natural evolution. And it uses the concepts of natural selection and genetic inheritance brought forth by Charles Darwin in 1859. So this is a really fascinating topic, and there are so many applications in the real world for genetic algorithms. I'm just going to show just a list of many of them on the left-hand side, but I'll let you know a couple more interesting uses. So if we look at the picture on the right-hand side, we have Mona Lisa, okay, and then we see a series of polygons on the left-hand side. Well, researchers have been able to actually generate the picture of Mona Lisa by evolving these polygons through a series of generations. So they can actually reconstruct this painting through genetic algorithms, which to me is just unbelievable. Another example that I saw was in materials engineering. So when you actually look at the layout of a circuit board, and you open up your computer and you pull out the circuit board and you look at where all the little nodes and electronic components, apparently the configuration and the layout of this design has been optimized through genetic algorithms. Now, video games, the AI that is used in video games also comes from genetic algorithms, but in a business context, we'll see many applications as well in optimization, scheduling, and when we get into our traveling salesman problem, I think it should be quite clear of what the business applications are. We spend so much time talking about programming using R, devising the right experiments to solve certain types of problems with computing, that I think it's important we take a step back and we just look at our natural environment. Nature is beautiful, and when you look at the very types of organisms that exist on our planet, to me they're all specially adapted to solve certain type of problems. And I wanted to show an example of a lemur known as the ii. Okay, and that's what we see on this picture here. And you see this lemur is kind of sitting on top of a rotten log. Inside this log are termites, and that's the primary food source for this animal. So how does this lemur get the termites out of the log? Well, it has an adaptation on its hand. If you look very carefully on its hand, and I have a picture of it on the right-hand side, you see a series of regular-looking fingers. And then there's one tiny, really thin finger, and it's a real bony finger, and it's much longer than the others. Well, it uses this finger to tap on the wood, and that's how it can determine whether or not the wood is hollow. And once it has found where the termites are sitting inside of the wood, it pokes a hole and it uses this finger to reach in and grab the termites out of it. So the hand structure is so perfectly adapted for this particular animal's survival that just through a series of evolution throughout the millennia, it has essentially been built for this one purpose. And the evolution and the diversity related to all of the organisms on Earth, to me it's startling. But you can see that through evolution, this particular animal is adapted to its environment. Well, there's many things that we can learn from nature. I mean, just looking at the natural kingdom and saying, these things are fantastic is one thing. How can we leverage it in terms of business or producing materials that help mankind? One example is the example of spider silk. And if you look at spider silk at a molecular level, you find that it's a very strong compound. And this compound is actually stronger than steel. So are there ways that we can make materials that are incredibly strong but incredibly lightweight? And drawing from the concepts of how spider silk is produced in nature, we are able to create some materials like that, if not using the spider silk directly. Before we get into the fun stuff, I think it's important that we have an understanding of evolution in the real world. And in order to understand biological processes properly, we must first have an understanding of the cell. Human bodies are made up of trillions of cells. Each cell has a core structure, a nucleus, that contains our chromosomes. And additionally, each of our 23 chromosomes are made up of tightly coiled strands of deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA. Genes are segments of DNA that determine specific traits, such as eye or hair color. Humans have more than 20,000 genes, and each gene determines some aspect of the organism. A collection of genes is sometimes called a genotype, and a collection of aspects, like eye characteristics, is sometimes called a phenotype. So these are just biological terms that are used to describe strands of DNA and how they function in biological processes. But we borrow some of these same ideas in our genetic algorithms as well. A gene mutation is an alteration in your DNA. It can be inherited or acquired during your lifetime as cells age or exposed to certain chemicals. Mutations can also be triggered through errors within the DNA replication process. Some changes in your genes result in genetic disorders. And one famous example of genetic disorders is the Elephant Man, or Joseph Merrick, and it is believed that he has suffered from a syndrome called Proteus syndrome, and that's what gives him his grotesque appearance. But what's interesting is that when a cell is dividing and creating a copy of itself, the DNA strands have to essentially unzip themselves and replicate. And during that replication process, where they're copying the material from one cell to the next, occasionally, over time, there can be errors in that process. And that error results in a mutation. And these mutations come about either naturally, just through, just sheer amount of time that has gone by in a person's life, or if you are exposed to, let's say, cosmic rays. If you're an astronaut, on the International Space Station, you're going to have mutations occur faster. So, and if you're exposed to certain chemicals, that of course can also trigger mutations. But mutations are just a part of life. Reproduction involves recombination of genes from parents and then small amounts of mutation, or the errors in the copying. The fitness of an organism is how much it can reproduce before it dies. And here is an example of the passing of chromosomes within human reproduction. So if I have a male and a female, in the female they have two X chromosomes, and in the male they have an X and a Y chromosome. If they have a female child, you're going to have a combination of an X from the mother and an X from the father. However, if you are male, you're going to have an X from your mother and a Y from your father. And when that genetic material is combined to create the offspring, there is a chance for mutation that happens. And the concept of fitness is one that we're going to explore down the road, but it's related to how much a particular entity can reproduce. Natural selection is a key component of Darwin's theory of evolution. And what natural selection is saying is that only the organisms best adapted to their environment tend to survive and transmit their genetic characteristics in increasing numbers to succeeding generations, while those less adapted tend to be eliminated. A genetic algorithm maintains a population of candidate solutions for the problem at hand, and it makes it evolve by iteratively applying a set of stochastic operators. So we'll get into the mechanics of genetic algorithms down the road, but I think it's important that when we look at only the strong survive. So characteristics that help us advance the problem we're trying to solve are going to be more valuable to us, and we want to keep those components. And if you're not well suited to a problem, you're probably going to go the way of the dodo bird. This now moves us into the topic of naturally inspired computing. The only intelligent systems on this planet are biological. Biological intelligences are designed by natural evolutionary processes. These intelligent organisms often work together in groups, swarms, or flocks. They also don't appear to use logic, mathematics, complex planning, complicated modeling of their environment. However, they can achieve complex information processing and computational tasks that current artificial intelligence solutions find very challenging. What is interesting for me is that biological organisms cope with the demands of their environments. They use solutions quite unlike the traditional human-engineered approaches to problem solving. They exchange information about what they've discovered in the places that they've visited. And bioinspired computing is a field devoted to tackling complex problems using computational methods modeled after design principles encountered in nature. And one example about very simple organisms that can exchange a lot of information very powerfully, we can just look at the ant. The ants are very simple creatures. So as they're walking around searching for a food source, when they find something that is of interest, they lay a chemical down, and this chemical trail instructs other ants to say, hey, one of our workers or one of our buddies found a good food source. Let's go ahead and grab this food. But at the same time, ants are very intuitive. Let's say in order to bring the food back, they have to cross a series of rocks. Well, if they have to cross these rocks, how do they walk past? And in this case, what they do is they actually create a bridge of ants. So they'll grab with their mandibles the torsos of other ants, and they'll form a chain structure which allows ants to crawl over the top of them. So, a very simple creature, not a lot of intuitive intelligence, is able to solve these complex problems using sheer simplicity of their approach. Now I want to talk a little bit about what classical computing strengths are versus bioinspired computing. So classical computing is very good at number crunching, processing large volumes of data. Thought support, so creating decision trees and being able to work through a problem. Rule-based reasoning, so if I feed certain rules into a computer, what do I expect to get out of it? And if I need to repeat a process consistently, if I can define the process very well, classical computing is very strong at this. However, classical computing has some weaknesses. It's not inherently strong at pattern recognition. Its robustness to damage. So if I have a corrupt bit in a computer, how does the entire system compensate for that? And how do I deal with vague and incomplete information? So the problems have to be structured in a well-defined manner in order for a classical computing environment to leverage its full strength. And most importantly, adapting and improving based on experience. So as more data is being fed through the system of varying source, can the system itself adapt to change? Can it follow this evolutionary track, if you will? What bio-inspired computing does is it takes a more evolutionary approach to learning. In traditional artificial intelligence, the intelligence is often programmed from above. And what this means is the intelligence actually has to be constructed by the programmer or developer. So, the logic and its intelligence comes really from the programmer. Now, bio-inspired computing, on the other hand, it takes a more bottom-up, decentralized approach. So there are just a series of rules that are given to the computer in terms of, how to understand its environment, and as data is fed in, it's able to synthesize it. And this method of specifying a set of simple rules and a set of simple organisms which adhere to these rules and how these organisms react to their environment is kind of the central catalyst of a bio-inspired computing system. And I just want to show a picture on the left-hand side of a project from DARPA called the LS3, which essentially looks like a horse combined with a dog. And what's interesting about this machine is that it can run on all sorts of different terrains, so on hills, rocks, And the approach that it uses draws from some of these bio-inspired computing ideas. Okay, now it is obviously a very sophisticated machine, but you can see that it's mimicking aspects in nature in its design, and it's really cool. If you get a chance, go to YouTube and just type DARPA projects and look at some of the machines that they're creating, and you see this bio-inspired computing approach really kind of taking off right now. So I think this bio-inspiration is going to be an aspect we're going to see in computers moving forward, most definitely. Well, that's great. Okay, so we've talked about these genetic algorithms. They're super wonderful. Bio-inspiration. Okay. Now I want to ground our discussion back into machine learning and predictive analytics. So let's suppose we have a problem, okay, and we really don't know how we want to solve this problem. Well, what can we do? No, most people will think, hey, you know what? I'm just going to feed this problem into a computer to somehow find a solution. Okay, and that would be great. Can it be done? And I guess the question is, can we frame the problem correctly in a way that allows for our computer to go about solving it? Well, first we have to have an understanding of what's called a brute force solution. And when we go about solving our problem, the question is, well, how do we do this? Do we just go through and run every iteration possible to try to solve this problem? And that's what a brute force solution really is. It's a blind generate and test algorithm. So it takes one solution and it says, okay, try it. How effective was I? I really wasn't that effective. Okay, well then I'm going to try a different variation. I'm going to repeat it. And it's going to generate a random possible solution. Then it's going to test the solution and see how well this particular solution performs. And then it stops once the solution is good enough. Okay, so it seems very straightforward, and it applies this brute force approach. Well, can we use this brute force idea in our problem solving? Sometimes we can. And if there's only a few possible solutions, we have enough time and a powerful computer to work with, then yes, we can use this idea. However, for most problems, we cannot use the brute force approach. So if I have a problem that has many possible solutions, well, there's no time to try them all. And you always hear about computer strength, increasing exponentially, and this allows for more types of problems to be addressed in a brute force approach. But we're going to see that it becomes very unrealistic very quickly. And here is just a very simple example, and there's a couple different approaches to this point. I've seen, looking at CPU processing time, and so on and so forth. But if I have a series of 5 data points, the total number of solutions that I have would be, in this case, 12. But if I have 6 data points that I'm trying to solve for, and these could be independent variables or dependent variables, my number of solutions goes up. It goes up to 60. If I go to 7 data points, you see that it grows up to 360, 8, it's growing even more, 9, 10, so on and so forth. So you see the number of solutions increasing very significantly with an increase in each data point. And if I'm looking at a problem that has 25 data points, we see that the distinct number of solutions is a gargantuan number. And when we go through our practical example later, we're going to have a lot of data points that we're going to work with. And the amount of time it's going to take a classical computer to process, this solution is very significant. So, what do you do if you have 50 data points or 100 data points? So we're going to find that this brute force approach really doesn't work well in practice, and we need a different way. And apparently there are lots of different ways that we can go about solving this problem. So genetic algorithms are a part of a series of algorithms that focus on search techniques. Okay, and if you're interested in this topic at a deeper level, there are many different focus areas. But for now, what we're looking at is a guided random search technique, and we're going to get into these evolutionary algorithms and specifically genetic algorithms. And I've highlighted them all with gray boxes outlined in red. In the most basic sense, this is what a genetic algorithm looks like. So, and we'll talk about all of these points, and when we get into our example, where we're walking through the concepts, I think it will make a little more sense. But for now, we just start by initializing a population. Then we have a fitness function that we have to create. And then we evaluate the fitness from our population. How well does our population of organisms, if you will, what is the fitness of them? Then we have certain constraints that we put out, and if the constraints are not satisfied, we select a candidate pool from the population for breeding. We have them breed, and part of the breeding process creates mutations, which is the randomly varying of individuals. Then we put them back into the population pool, and we evaluate the fitness. We do this over and over until the constraints have been satisfied. Once the constraints have been satisfied, then we output the results from our algorithm. So, a very simple idea in principle. I mean, it can be explained, in one PowerPoint slide, but we're going to see that that the nuances of it really are fascinating and very rich and complex. When I first started learning about genetic algorithms, the concept of encoding a solution I didn't really grasp at first. Okay, so I just thought, okay, I've got a certain characteristic of a variable, and I want to just feed it in, and I'll use this genetic algorithm, like many other machine learning techniques, like a neural network, a support vector machine, decision tree, so on and so forth. But when we work with genetic algorithms, we have to take this data and we have to prepare it in a special way, and they call this encoding of a solution. So I would definitely spend some time and really kind of focus on these next couple of slides, because you'll find that they're central to how we deploy a genetic algorithm. And the solution that we encode, it depends on what we're trying to solve with genetic algorithms. So different problems require different encoding approaches. Now, genetic algorithms often encode solutions as fixed length bit strings, okay, which can be thought of as chromosomes. Okay, and these bit strings are just a long string of characters, okay, that have ones and zeros. Okay, and they're just binary, 1 is a yes, 0 is a no, and so on and so forth. And we think of these as chromosomes, if you will. And each bit represents some aspect of the proposed solution to the problem. So we'll talk about this with our practical example, and I think it will be clear on how this works. But just remember, these long string of characters, all these bits, they relate to some portion of the problem we're trying to solve. And for genetic algorithms to work, we need to be able to test any string or chromosome and get a score indicating how good that solution is. Okay, so we have to take our bit string and we have to say, how well does this particular bit string perform given the task that we're trying to solve? So let's talk a little more about this bit string. Okay. The set of all possible solutions is called the search space, or the state space. In this example, it's just one number, but it could be many numbers. Often, genetic algorithms code numbers in binary, producing a bit string representing a solution. We chose 0 or 1 bits, which is enough to represent 0 to 1,000. So if I'm looking at my binary representation, on the right-hand side, you see I have a series of 4 characters, okay, and I have 4 of these series. Each one of these series represents some parameter to the problem I'm trying to solve, okay, and that code for parameter 1 of 1000 might represent a value of, let's say, 4 in this case. Parameter 2 might represent a value of 7. Okay, I'm just throwing these numbers out there. But the combinations of zeros and ones mean something in the context of our genetic algorithm. And then we'll talk about how to set that up a little bit later. Well, this topic of the search space, okay, so this is the function that we're trying to determine with our genetic algorithms. In many instances, a simple function of this, represented by f of x, is one-dimensional. But by encoding several values into the chromosome, many dimensions can be searched. So we can actually, instead of having just a simple one-dimensional approach, we can have a two-dimensional approach. The search space can be visualized as a surface or fitness landscape in which fitness dictates the height. So it's the peaks in this space that we're interested in, okay, because the fitness is the height in this case. Each possible genotype is a point in the space. And a genetic algorithm tries to move the points to better places or a higher fitness in the space. So if we're looking at the landscape on the right-hand side, we see the red portions have the highest peaks, okay, and each genetic algorithm, we're trying to move the population to the higher points of these peaks. So this fitness landscape, okay, this brain, if you will, or the surface, you can see it has all these rugged configuration. It kind of looks like, a series of jagged rocks, if you will. But that's just the visualization of the surface based on the problem that we're trying to solve. We can see that different types of genetic algorithm problems have different type of fitness landscapes. And I just want to show just a couple of different visualizations of what these landscapes look like, because each problem you're trying to solve might have a different landscape to it. Okay, and so that's what makes these problems so interesting to me, is that the shapes and contours of these surfaces can vary in such incredible ways. If you look at the image on the bottom right, it looks like a series of jagged lines. It almost looks like grass, that's been freshly mowed. Directly above it, we see that there are 2 very large peaks coming out of the middle, and that's what we're trying to optimize with our genetic algorithm. So, modeling these surfaces, gives us an idea of, the complexity related to the problem at hand. So now let's talk about these fitness functions a little bit. Okay, so we have these various shapes that we're talking about, and we need to have functions to describe them. Well, most genetic algorithms use explicit and static fitness functions. Now, some genetic algorithms, such as artificial life or evolutionary robotics, use dynamic and implicit fitness functions, kind of like how many obstacles did I avoid? I was watching a documentary, I think it was with Morgan Freeman, it's called Through the Wormhole, and they were showing some of these artificial life or evolutionary robotics where as soon as they're born, they have a task that they're trying to solve, and that's to flip over. So they start on their back, and they have to figure out, using its arms and legs, how to flip itself to the other side. It's given a very set of basic instructions on how to move, arms and legs, but through genetic algorithms, it's able to determine this after different iterations. Okay, and the fitness function in this case is, did I successfully flip over? Okay, so this is an example of how a genetic algorithm is used in a different context. Okay. But we can think of the fitness functions such as an individual's fitness divided by the average fitness of the population. Another important aspect is we have to select parents for breeding. So if I have a population of organisms, how do I find the best pair to bring together? Now, if you look at just humans in general, you see that sometimes supermodels will marry star athletes. Okay, so you'll have people with a very high pedigree combining and producing these beautiful, talented offspring. But at the same time, there can be more blue-collar individuals that just come together, and it's almost like it's happening through random chance. Okay, so just because you're the fittest individual in a population doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be the one who breeds. Okay, and we have to, in our algorithm, find a method for this breeding as well. Okay, and there are many different ways to look at this. Okay. One way that you do it is you score these bit strings or these chromosomes, and depending on your score, it increases your possibility of being selected. And one approach that is used is called the roulette wheel. What you do is you add up the fitnesses of all the chromosomes, you generate a random number R in that range, and then you select the first chromosome in the population that, when all previous fitnesses are added, gives you, at a minimum, the value R. Now that we've selected our candidate pool using the roulette wheel selection approach, we have to now look at the genetic material of the parents. Okay, so the mother and father, if you will. When you're looking at these genes, we have to identify what's called the crossover point. Okay, and it's a single point identified at random between two chromosomes. A crossover rate is predetermined, and when we predetermine this, we use a high probability number like 0.8 or 0.95, and then the crossover is applied to the parents. The idea is that crossover preserves good bits from different parents, combining them to produce better solutions. So when we're looking at the genetic material between the two different parents, we have to say, okay, at the third bit in the bit string, okay, I'm going to create my crossover point right here. And then between the parents, after they have different children, I'm going to flip the material. So if you're looking at the color coding that we have black and yellow on the left-hand side, and after the crossover, you see for two children in this case, that some of the genetic material is now mixed between the two parents. Okay. And that's really what this crossover point and this crossover rate performs. A good encoding scheme tries to preserve these good bits during crossover and mutation. So that crossover point, why is it at the third, line of the bit string instead of the fourth? And it's looking at the population and it's trying to understand, the amount of information that it's gaining and choosing the right cutoff point for flipping these bits. Okay, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to preserve the bits that provide the most value. With some small probability, the mutation rate, if you will, we flip each bit in the offspring. Typical values for the mutation rate are very small and are usually values between 0.1 and 0.001. What this does is it causes movement in the search space. And it also has this added benefit of it restores lost information to the population. So I have two parents, right, and I produce a child, okay, and in this case, child 1, we see in our image on the right-hand side. We see the black and yellow material, okay, that shows, the combination of their chromosomes. But then we have this mutation rate. So after they've been bred together, it doesn't mean it's going to be a one-for-one match. We can see after the mutation that just one bit in this bit string is just kind of flipped. So instead of it being a 0, it becomes a 1 in child 1. And we highlight this in blue. And in child 2, instead of it being a 1, we see this bit flipping to a 0. Okay. And this is a very important aspect because this is what is mimicking the biological process itself. So when we talk about survival of the fittest and adaptations to your environment, the II, if you will, mutation is a critical component. So there are many variants of genetic algorithms. Okay, so we just talked about a very simple example. Okay, and there are different types of selection. Okay, so instead of using the roulette wheel approach, you can use tournaments, elitism, etc., etc. There's different recombination procedures. Okay, so multi-point crossovers, three-way crossovers, and so on and so forth. And there are different kinds of encoding other than the bit string. So integer values, an ordered set of symbols. And when we go through our practical example, we're going to see a couple of these different encoding methods. And there's different approaches to the mutation. So genetic algorithms, in a broad sense, can take many shapes and forms. Okay, and so, what I'm showing is just one structure of a genetic algorithm in machine learning, but there are definitely different ways to go about these problems. Well, some considerations when we're actually building and deploying genetic algorithms, we have to look at how we're representing the population, okay, the candidate pool, if you will. What's our size of candidates? What's the mutation rate? So on and so forth. How do I select candidates from this pool? How do I remove them from the pool? What are my crossover mutation operators? At what point in the bit string do I make the cut? And how frequent do I have these mutations occur? What is a success for the genetic algorithm? How do I devise the termination criterion? What's the performance that I'm looking for, the scalability? These are computationally expensive algorithms. So, from a hardware standpoint, how do I want to employ these algorithms to ensure that my processes, are achieving the performance and scalability that I want? And I think a key point is that the solution is only as good as the evaluation function, which is often the hardest part to define in a genetic algorithm. So this evaluation function and how you set this up for your own problems, you have to spend a lot of time really thinking about, getting the correct construction here. Okay, so if you have the wrong construct, your entire solution is going to be all for naught. Well, now that we've talked about the mechanics of it, I want to go through a very simple example to showcase all of these steps in action. Okay, so a lot of it is a high-level concept so far. I think it's important that we just take a very simple example and walk through it. So I want now to focus on that algorithm that we looked at earlier. Okay, and I'm going to spell it out using text here, and I'm going to refer back to this text. Okay, but our basic genetic algorithm process is as follows. We produce an initial population of individuals. Then we evaluate the fitness of all individuals. While some termination criterion is not met, then we do the following. Then we select fitter individuals for reproduction. Then we recombine between the individuals. we have mutation of these individuals, and then we evaluate the fitness of the modified individuals, and then generate a new population, and then we go through the process over and over again. Okay. What we're going to do now is we're going to focus on a problem called the max 1 problem. And it's a very simple problem. Is what we're trying to do is we're trying to maximize the number of ones in a string of L binary digits. Okay. It may seem trivial because we know the answer in advance. So let's say I create a string of 10 digits, if you will, so 10 little bits of 0 and 1. Well, I know the maximum amount of ones in this string are going to be 10. Okay. But we can think of it as maximizing the number of correct answers, each encoded by 1, to L yes or no difficult questions. Okay, so instead of it just being a simple counting exercise, think of each one of these bits as a series of questions, and we're trying to solve a grander problem by the answer of these difficult yes or no questions. So as far as encoding is concerned, an individual is encoded as a string of L binary digits. So let's say L is equal to 10 in this case, then I'm going to have 10 bits of information, and if I have the number of 1, you're going to see I'm going to have 9 zeros and a 1. So let's start with a population of n random strings. Okay, and let's suppose that our bit string length is 10 and n is equal to 6. We're going to toss a fair coin 60 times. And when we do this, we get the following initial population. Okay, so I have a population of 6 random strings. Each one of these 6, I have 10 bits of information, and I'm flipping a coin. So heads is 1, tails is 0. Okay, I'm just flipping my fair coin. Okay, and this is what we get in the population. Now we have to create our fitness function. Okay, so our fitness function in this case is it's a simple count of the number of ones in the bit string. So I go through each one of these 6 bit strings, and I just tally up the number of ones. Okay, so in the first one, I see it equaling 7. The second one, I see it equaling 5. Then 7, then 4, then 8, and 3. And then I sum them up, and I get a total value of 34. So this is a very simple one-dimensional problem. Okay, so that surface that we're talking about, instead of that 3-dimensional rocky landscape, it's just a very simple one-dimensional approach. Next, we apply the fitness proportion selection with the roulette wheel method. Okay, so we talked about this roulette wheel, but now I want to really kind of show how it works. Okay. So the individual I will have the probability to be chosen through the following function. So the probability of being selected from this pool for breeding purposes is going to be f of I over the summation of f of I. And the area in this case is proportional to the fitness value. Okay, so if you are a very strong candidate, you have incredible genes, you're smart, athletic, you're beautiful, you're going to have a larger area in this pie chart. Okay, and that's what I would imagine by item number 6 in this case. We repeat this extraction process as many times as the number of individuals. Okay, and what's interesting in this is that, so I go through my wheel and I say, okay, I'm going to take 6 candidates out. Okay, I spin my wheel like Wheel of Fortune, and I land on number 6. Okay, so I pull out number 6 and I say, congratulations, you are allowed to breed. Okay. Then I spin the wheel again. Okay, and when I spin the wheel again, 6 isn't removed because he was selected before. He's back in the pool. Okay, so he might be lucky and get a chance to have a second mate. Okay. And we do this process 6 times, okay, equal to the number of individuals in our candidate pool. So let's suppose that after performing the selection, we get the following population. So now I have my candidates, which are now denoted by S prime in this case, and we find out which ones are allowed to breed. And we see that candidate number 5 appears twice in this pool. So he gets to breed with number 3 and number 6. So he's the lucky one, or she. So for each couple, then, we decide according to the crossover probability, and for our instance, 0.6, whether or not to perform the crossover. Suppose that we decide to actually perform crossover only for couples S1, S2, and S5, and S6. So for each couple, we randomly select a crossover point. Okay, for instance, 2 for the first, and 5 for the second. Okay. So we can see our different pairs, having these different crossover points selected. After we perform the crossover, then we see that exchange of the information. The bits flip between the 2 different groups. So what's interesting in this case, and what you should remember, is that crossover point is flexible for each one of those pairs. It's not, we're always going to flip it at the second bit or the 5th bit. Well, the final step is to apply random mutation, as we had talked about before. So for each bit that we are to copy to the new population, we allow for a small probability of error. So this mutation change, and in this case, we specified our mutation rate to be 0.1. Remember, as we had said before, this causes movement in the search space. Okay, so it's not necessarily moving, towards the best solution in this case. It's kind of a random fluctuation, and it can be applied either locally or at the global level. And what's nice about this is it restores information or lost information to the population. So just because you're taking 2 pairs and breeding them, you don't always have a better result. Through the mutation, we actually can return some of that information back to the population. And we see now that after applying our mutation, that we have certain bits that are now flipping. Okay. And what's important to note is that some chromosomes don't experience any mutation. Okay? So we don't see any of these red bits. And there are some chromosomes that actually have 2 points of mutation in the bit string. So when we're looking at mutation, we have to understand that it applies in this way as well. So after applying mutation, then we go back and we evaluate our function. So we sum up the number of ones. In this case, we've tallied them to the right-hand side. So we've got, for the first string, we have a total of 6, 7, 8, 5, 5, 6. But when I sum all of them together, I now receive a value of 37. So in one generation, the total population fitness changed from 34 to 37, which improved by 9%. So at this point, we go through the same process all over again until stopping criteria is met. So now that we've talked about the entire process of producing a genetic algorithm, let's just recap some of the advantages and disadvantages. So from an advantage standpoint, the concepts are easy to understand. They draw their inspiration from nature. So anytime that we can take cues from nature in our computing, we should. And I think there are some advantages in doing so. Genetic algorithms have many areas of applications. I showed that list earlier of all the different areas that we can look in, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. Genetic algorithms are powerful. Okay, so if you're trying to solve certain problems, this process will give you very strong solutions. They are intrinsically parallel. Okay, so they lend themselves to distributed computing processes. And what's nice is you always get an answer, and the answer gets better with time. So the more time you can devote to breeding the population and going through the survival of the fittest mechanisms, you're going to get stronger and better answers. In some instances, depending on the approach that we're going for, there could be less time required for certain applications. So we talked about that brute force approach. You can use brute force. It can be very time intensive and resource intensive, but you can, instead of this brute force approach, apply a genetic algorithm. And this genetic algorithm might get you to a solution very similar, if not the same, in much less time and resources. And what's nice is that your chances of getting the optimal solution are greater when you use genetic algorithms. So, drawing from the, hey, I'm going to continue to breed this pool over and over, eventually you're going to get to that optimal solution. Now, there are some limitations. The population considered for the evolution should be moderate or suitable one for the problem. So how do you define this initial population? Do you have thousands of possible population candidates, or a smaller set? And you have to think about this as you're constructing your problem and framing it in a genetic algorithm. Your crossover rate should be between 80 to 95%. Now you can obviously explore with different combinations as you see fit. Okay, but choosing that crossover rate is critical. Your mutation rate should be very low, as we had said. 0.5 to 1%, or even less than that, is assumed as best. So you don't want to speed up the evolutionary process through mutation, because if you're flipping with crossover rates and then mutating at a very high level, you're just putting that genetic diversity back into the pool. Okay, so you're not actually gaining the information that you want. So you want to keep that mutation rate low. The method of selection should be appropriate for the problem. So a lot of times people want to use genetic algorithms and they can't frame it correctly. Okay, so you really have to spend a lot of time thinking about how this particular approach applies to the problem. And as we had talked about before, that writing of the fitness function has to be accurate. Okay, so this fitness function and how you construct it is critical to your success. Okay, and a limitation that you're going to find is that you're going to construct the wrong fitness function. Okay, well now that we've talked about the theory, we've gone through the biological processes, we talked about the machine learning components and how to build genetic algorithms, I want to now show how we can use these in practical examples. And the first one we're going to start with is the knapsack problem. Well, what is the knapsack problem? Okay, and we can think of it as the following. Suppose that we're going to spend a month in the wilderness. We're taking a backpack with us. However, the maximum weight we can carry is 20 kilograms. So we have a number of survival items available to us, okay? And these items that are available, have their own value, as we're calling survival points. Our objective is to maximize the number of survival points. So we want to put items into our bag that help us survive our month in the wilderness. This type of problem is called a constrained optimization problem because we are limited to carrying a maximum weight of 20 kilograms. So what's interesting about this is we have a constraint. Okay, and so now when we make our genetic algorithm to try to solve this, we also have to include in our function the fact that 20 kilograms is the limit. So our goal for this exercise is we're going to devise a genetic algorithm to solving this particular problem. As with all of my tutorials, I first like to look at the data. Okay. So if I'm looking at the data set, we're going to do a very simple example here. I have 3 columns in this case, and a number of rows. I have 7 rows. Okay, so one column is the item, okay, pocket knife, beans, potatoes. It has its various survival points, and we have a weight assigned to the right-hand side. Now what's important here is that each row will be encoded into a chromosome bit string. Okay? So a single row represents a single value in the bit string. So for example, my first row, pocket knife, okay, I'm going to, in my bit string, I'm going to give it a 1 or a 0 for the first value. 1 to say include it, 0 to say don't include it. Okay. So there are 7 row entries in our chromosome, and as I had just said, a 0 represents don't include and a 1 represents include. Therefore, an example of a chromosome that we're going to look at in this case would be 7 characters long, and it will have a series of 1s and 0s. So in this case, I'm just showing a very simple one of 1 0 0 1 0 1 1. In this tutorial, I'm going to also include some of the R code to devising these algorithms. So I think it's important to see the code and to see how to actually create these functions. Talking about the concepts is one thing. I think it's important to have a reference point. Now, most of my tutorials, I don't actually get into the coding in the tutorial itself, but I think that this one is important to look at just as a frame of reference if you're trying to construct these on your own. Okay. And what we do in this case is we're creating this data set from scratch. Okay, so I'm creating my data frame, okay, I'm giving the various columns and the values, and I'm also setting a variable to represent the maximum weight limit. So in this case I have a weight limit variable, and it's defined to be 20. Then I can use some code to show us how to create a chromosome to include the first, fourth, and fifth item. Okay. And so I'm just writing in this case, I'm saying chromosome equals 2, and then I'm creating a bit string, if you will, of various zeros and ones. And if I take the following code, okay, from my data set, and then I put the bracket chromosome equals 1, I can find out just the values that have 1s, and I can actually calculate what the sum total of survival points is for this particular chromosome. So this code that we have right here just shows us exactly how to do that. Now there are many different packages in R to approach these problems, and I'm going to talk about 2 packages in particular. But for the first problem that we're going through, this knapsack problem, we're going to use the gen algorithm, so GENALG. When we use this algorithm, one important aspect to understand is it's trying to optimize towards a minimum value. So we're not trying to maximize the weight. Inherently in the algorithm, it's trying to minimize it. Okay. So when we're working with this algorithm, we have to take the solution and we have to multiply it by -1 in order to reverse the polarity. So a configuration which leads to exceeding the weight constraint returns a value of 0, and a higher value can also be given. Okay, so here's my R code again. We're going to invoke the library GENALG. Now I'm creating this evaluation function. We talked about the importance of these evaluation functions and how they process. But look very carefully at the code that I have here and see how the weight limit fits into the solution that I have presented. Okay, so I have a if else return type statement. I have my function that is calculating this certain amount of points, and it's checking it against that weight limit. So the next step is, okay, so that we've defined this evaluation function, if you will, we have to actually configure our genetic algorithm. So I'm creating a model that I'm just calling the GA model, And this is exactly how I specify this algorithm in the GEN ALG package. Okay, so you can play around with it as you see fit. You change your mutation rates, change the number of iterations and the population size. But notice, some of the components, such as my eval function is equal to my eval function, which is the name of the function from before. So when I run this algorithm, the type is a binary chromosome. So in this particular package that we're using, it knows that I'm creating a bit string of zeros and ones as default. So after I run the model and I review the model, we see the best solution at the bottom. And we can see this in our example of it being, a bit string of 1101111. So if I look at the optimal knapsack configuration, so the one that gives me the maximum amount of survival points while keeping my weight under 20, we see that this is what the data set actually looks like. So this is an example of using a genetic algorithm to find the ideal number of items following a constraint. So I think this is a valuable exercise when trying to understand how to employ genetic algorithms in practice. I now want to shift gears and dive into a different type of practical example. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at feature selection and a regression analysis, a linear regression using OLS. There are many types of problems you can solve with genetic algorithms. I like this problem in particular because I see it crossing over to other types of machine learning processes. Okay, so if I'm building predictive models in other capacities and I want to draw from different techniques, I think there's a real potential for using genetic algorithms in this space, and I think you'll see it as well. When we approach machine learning tasks, we are often confronted with many variables within a particular data set, which can be used to build our predictive models. Okay. In previous lectures, we discussed employing some techniques that draw from AIC and BIC to reduce the candidate variable pool. These techniques include, the forward selection, backward selection, and stepwise selection techniques. Now what we're going to do is we're going to explore using genetic algorithms for this feature selection. Our goal is to devise a genetic algorithm to approach feature selection. And additionally, we're also going to estimate the coefficients for an OLS regression model using genetic algorithms. So I'm just kind of tucking in another technique of genetic algorithms in this section as well. But if you have a large data set with many different variables, paring down that list of variables to those which help to describe the model that you're trying to produce is a critical step in our EDA process and our model building. So how do we go about this? And can we use genetic algorithms? So we're first going to pull in a data set from a package in R called using R. Okay, and the data set is called FAT. Now one thing before we begin, I did do a little data munging where I said if I have any nulls in the data set, let's go ahead and remove those observations. Okay, so if you're going to try to reconstruct this example, just understand that I also performed that one step. Now our goal is to create a linear regression model using body fat series as a dependent variable and some ideal subset of variables as the independent variables. Okay, so I've got a number of variables here on the right, and there's actually a couple more. I couldn't include them in. What variables do we want to include in this model? Well, first, let's create a linear regression model. Okay, I want to understand, my genetic algorithm and how it performs. In order to do so, I first have to get a sense of the data by creating my own regression model. So in this case, I'm just going to bring in all of these variables. Okay, so in R, I specify my LM formula as following, we can see in our regression formula, and I get the output from R, where I get my parameter estimates, statistical significance, my standard errors, and I get some performance metrics, like my R squared and my adjusted R square. Now, one thing to note, the adjusted R squared is 0.7353, and there are a number of statistically insignificant variables at the 0.05 level. So this just gives me a baseline of, okay, how well does our linear regression model perform. So now we're going to develop some additional R code to prepare the model to run using the following. Now, instead of using the GEN-ALG algorithm, we're going to use the GA algorithm. Okay, so we're going to invoke this from the package GA. First, I prepare the data and I create an X and Y variable. Okay, so I have my response variable, and then I have my independent variables. We can see with the following code the fitness function that I'm producing in this case. And what the fitness function is, it's estimating the regression model using predictors identified by a 1 in the corresponding position of the string. Each column or variable is converted into a binary string with 1 equaling include or 0 equaling not include. So in our knapsack problem, we looked at each row being encoded as a 0 or a 1. Now, think of it in terms of each column now is going to be encoded as a 0 or a 1. Okay, so just flip it from the horizontal to the vertical conceptually, and I think you'll get it. So now we run the genetic algorithm. Okay, in this case, the model parameters are a little different than the GEN-ALG approach, but this is the code that we would use, and here's the outcome that we get. Okay. Now I have to specify in this case, that the type is a binary bit string. Okay, I specify my fitness function, my number of bits, what columns I'm looking at, and how I want to monitor the process. In this case, I'm using a plot for assessing the fitness value for each generation that I've produced. So by default, if I don't specify it, I only get 100 generations. There's a default crossover probability and mutation probability put in. So if I want to specify that, I can, of course, go back to this code and actually, specify, what my mutation level should be, for example. But when I run this, I see a solution that is output in the summary at the bottom. Okay, and we see solution equaling, and we've got just a number of variables, and then we have underneath it a series of zeros and ones. Okay. So this solution that we see here, all the ones are going to be the variables that the process had said, hey, let's bring them into the model because we think that they offer additional value. Now what's interesting is we can actually take the results of this genetic algorithm and we can pass them as a parameter in a linear regression model. So rather than just going out and saying, okay, type in each parameter one at a time from the result, we can actually just leverage it directly from the genetic algorithm. So if you're trying to build efficient models and you're trying to optimize the process and say, okay, I'm going to go from a genetic algorithm to a linear regression, you can with the following code. Okay, so study this code carefully. It can be helpful. Now, what's interesting is that the adjusted R squared is slightly better at 0.7382. So reducing the pool of variables actually gave us a slightly better performance of this model. Now, what I also find interesting is that there are some variables that are included in this model, like HIP, for instance, that has a p-value that's significantly higher than 0.05. Okay, and that's one of the drawbacks that we get from this approach. So now imagine taking this idea where I'm going to use a genetic algorithm to find variables that are optimizing the AIC or the BIC criterion, to reduce my candidate pool. And then you take this reduced candidate pool and now you feed it into an artificial neural network, which is a topic I've discussed in a previous lecture. So taking these biological processes and combining them in novel, interesting ways, to me opens up a wide area in the machine learning, artificial intelligence domain. And it doesn't have to be an artificial neural network. You can use a deep learning algorithm, okay, and you can use support vector machines. So there's a lot that you can approach using genetic algorithms, okay, but you have to understand the nuances of these different models in order to leverage them correctly. So now that we've talked about feature selection, I want to do this example about the OLS parameter estimates with a genetic algorithm. And I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. What we want to do is we want to actually create a genetic algorithm to approximate the parameter estimates, okay, so the beta coefficients, if you will. So we're going to use the following air quality data set and the GA package in R. So if I just look at the air quality data set, this is what sits in this data. What we're going to do is we're going to build a linear regression model with ozone as the dependent variable and wind and temperature as the independent variables. Okay, and we're gonna focus on this as a simpler example because as we can see, it becomes a lot more complicated in terms of constructing the genetic algorithm. But it's the proof of concept that we're going for here. So here's what our fitness function is going to look like for our genetic algorithm. So in this case, instead of calling it fitness, I'm calling it OLS. Okay, and we actually see that we have the y hat equaling beta naught plus beta 1 times 10 times wind plus beta 2 times 10. Okay, and we're calculating our SSE, and we're walking through that particular function. Okay, so it's evaluating a linear function, essentially in this case. And then what we're trying to do is we're trying to minimize the SSE for each chromosome in a manner very similar to what ordinary least squares does. So let's show what the actual genetic algorithm looks like for this model. So when I run it, this is the code that I have to put in, and I'll explain a little bit of what these different pieces mean. Now notice that the values are real based, and we specify a minimum of -100 and a maximum of 100 for each of the coefficients, beta naught, beta 1, beta, and beta 2. So instead of it saying in a bit string concept or a binary response, a 0 or a 1, I am saying that, hey, this parameter estimate for beta naught, for our intercept term, if you will, can be a number as low as -100 and as high as +100. Okay, and it could be somewhere in between. It can have floating decimal points. But I'm specifying that threshold band. Now, I could make it -50 to +50 and have a smaller set to look in, but am I going to capture the right performance of this model through the smaller band? And that's something that we have to consider when working with models like this. Okay, but the real value type in this case is saying that it's going to be a floating decimal point. It can be a value that falls somewhere between the minimum and maximum. And each one of these coefficients, so beta naught, beta 1, beta 2, you can actually see in the terms. I'm repeating, in the formula for minimum, you see -100, comma -100, comma -100, and you see it repeating 3 times because we have 3 terms in our function that we're passing back to it. So Now I'm also including names for these terms just to make it a little easier to understand. But when we actually look at the results of the genetic algorithm on the right hand side, we see some settings that are just part of the normal process, and then the results on the bottom, which I find to be very interesting. We see our solution in this case. So we see a value for our intercept, a value for wind, and a value for temperature. What's so interesting to me is that the sum of squared errors is 50990.17 with the genetic algorithm compared to 50988.96 with the OLS approach. So these values are almost identical. They're not quite identical, but they're almost identical. And what this is telling me is that just the manner in which we constructed our linear function using genetic algorithms and breeding and mutation and just evolving these parameter terms, kind of mimicking an evolutionary process, is just a really cool way to go about this type of problem. Is it the most efficient way? Probably not. But if you want to look at regression models with a different approach, this is one way that you can go about it. And I think it's just a real cool way to do it. Now we're going to shift gears and we're going to get into another practical example called the traveling salesman. So what is the traveling salesman problem? One of the major topics in operations research is what is known as a traveling salesman problem. And this problem can be stated as follows. There is a set of cities a salesman needs to visit, and each city must be visited once. What's the shortest way through all of the cities? This problem has real-world implications, but not limited to, related to cost reductions, increasing efficiencies for deliveries, and customer satisfaction. So if I'm thinking about genetic algorithms in a business context, the traveling salesman problem is a great problem to look into. Okay, because if you can reduce the amount of travel that the salesman has to go from point to point, you're going to reduce depreciation on his car, reimbursement for his gas, his time, and you're just going to create efficiencies. Now, if you have a distribution company, so you're, let's say, in the freight industry, if you take the wrong route, to make your deliveries, that's real expenses that hit you on the bottom line in your P&L. And if you can make your deliveries faster to your customers, so like a UPS or a USPS or FedEx, you're going to increase your customer satisfaction. So finding the optimum route in the traveling salesman problem, I think, is incredibly important, and there's a lot of value in business. Our goal for this exercise is to devise a genetic algorithm to approach solving this particular problem. As always, I like to understand the data that I'm working with. And if you search online, you're going to find a lot of people going about tackling the traveling salesman problem. Okay, and I don't want to just regurgitate exactly what everybody is putting out there, but I want to show the type of data that is more realistic that we're going to be working with as a data scientist. You're not going to get everything in a nice, tidy package to work with. Okay, and I think this is a very realistic looking data set that we're going to approach tackling this problem. Okay, so in this case I have a series of customers. I have their address, so where these customers are located. And then these addresses have been converted into latitude and longitudinal points. And just to be fair, I just opened up a map and I just clicked at random. Okay, so I was just clicking on a Google map and just recording what the latitude and longitudes are. So it's not like these are any of my friends or my enemies. This is just random data points. So I want to show the data among reshaping aspects which are important to solve this problem. Okay, so we're going to focus on this in the next couple of slides. Now, before we begin the example, let's say we have 5 salesmen and we want to send them to specific addresses. Okay, so the classic problem is just, one salesman, find the most efficient route. I think this is a prime opportunity to draw from another machine learning technique that we've discussed in earlier presentations, in this case clustering. Okay. So for this example, because I know I have 5 salesmen and I want to send them to 5 specific addresses, I'm going to use a k-means clustering approach where I'm going to specify the k equaling to 5. Now, there are other ways you can go about creating these clusters, so on and so forth, but for simplicity's sake, we're just going to go with a k-means of k equals 5. Now, the results of our clustering, when plotted, are shown on the right-hand side. So I have my latitude, my longitude on my graph, and I have all these data points spread out, and the different colors represent each cluster where I'm going to send one salesman to go in door to door to each one of these groups of customers. Now, before I move into the next slide, I just want you to pay close attention to these green dots, okay, because these green dots are what's going to be important. Just notice the spread in the pattern and just kind of store that in the back of your mind. So let's focus our analysis on a single cluster, and in this case we're just going to look at the third cluster, or k equals 3 in this case. And you can see from this chart in this case that this follows that spread that I had just spoke about. Okay, so we can see all the data points, and there's a number of them. So it's not like we're only looking at 3 or 4 data points. I mean, we're looking closer to 20. Well, 16 or 17, I guess. Well, before we can really work on this problem correctly, we have to transform the latitude and longitudinal coordinates between each of the points into what's known as a distance matrix before we can continue. Okay, so I have 2 sets of code here. Again, I'm not going to get too much into the code, but I have to create a function first. Okay, and so that if we execute the function on the right-hand side, so we just type all this code into R and just execute it all. Okay, then I can go back to my original data set, and on the left-hand side, I can prepare the data in a certain way. I remove, the address, the number of the cluster. I change the name of the remaining 3 columns. So I, instead of customer ID, I call it name, latitude, and longitude, or lat and lon. And then below, where it says, run the geographic distance function .r, I have dist matrix less than dash, then I have what's geodistance in meters matrix, and then I refer to this TSP data. Well, that's all that's going to do is that's going to call this function on the right-hand side that we've previously executed. After we do that, then I convert this data into a matrix, okay? And so I call it D, and then as matrix, or as dot matrix, and then refer back to my dist matrix. Okay, so this is a lot of our code that has to go in, but it's necessary to convert these geographical coordinates from latitude to longitude into something that works for the problem. Okay, so we can't cheap out on this particular step. So once we do this, this is what we actually get as our result. So I have customers on the horizontal and vertical axis, and then I have distances between the customers. And this is, of course, important because what we're trying to do is we're trying to solve the problem where we're minimizing the distances. Okay, and all the distances here are represented in meters. Okay, so all that cleaning work gets the data into this type of structure, which is absolutely necessary. Well, now that we have this data structured in this type of way, we can actually go about and we can create our fitness function. In this case, I'm calling it tour length. Okay, and if you look at the code that we have here, this is the code that you're going to have to put when creating your own traveling salesman problem. And just copy it verbatim, just throw it into your algorithm and you'll be fine. We then run the genetic algorithm in the GA package specifying the type permutation. Okay, so instead of binary and real valued, we're now going to use permutation in this case. Here you can see I have some of the other parameters that I'm specifying, such as the population size, the maximum number of iterations, my run, and my mutation rate. So here's the output of the algorithm. Okay, so I have my chart that's assessing the fitness value versus the overall generations, and I can see where it levels off and the variation that we get in the pool and the overall results. Now there is a solution that corresponds to the unique path, and we can show it by accessing the following code. Okay, so after you run your genetic algorithm and you type in apply GA at solution, comma 1, comma tour length, comma D, you're going to find what the actual unique path is. To show you exactly how this works, imagine I take my salesman and I just say, okay, you've got all these points, just randomly go about all these different points. And we see this in the first route, that we see that the order in which that our salesman is going about the different houses, if you will, that there really is no pattern. Okay, it's just kind of zigzaggy and it's moving all over the place. Well, after we apply our genetic algorithm to this problem, we see our final route. And in this case, it's optimized. We found the shortest amount of the distance between the points. And the code that I have down below will show you exactly how to graph this result. Okay. But I find this absolutely fascinating because now we can see exactly the order in which they should go about these houses, and we can leverage that for other purposes. One last point I want to make on the traveling salesman problem is we've got the data, and we have this geospatial coded data. Okay. Well, we can do other things in R with it. Okay. So right now I just showed a very primitive graph where it's just base R, it's latitude and longitude on the XY axis. But maybe I want to push this back into something that's a little more beautiful. Maybe I want to embed it in an application or a website, if you will. Okay. So I can take those points and I can actually pass it back to a Google map. So here's my optimal solution depicted on a Google map. And all I'm doing is I'm invoking the ggmap package through the library ggmap, and then I'm accessing the Google API. And then I'm just taking my results from my genetic algorithm and I'm just pushing it onto the Google map. So play around with this. Look at different code. Approach the problem using your own intuition. And there's many different ways you can tackle genetic algorithms. I've shown a couple examples in this tutorial. I've gone through some of the theory behind it, but they're super powerful, they're very interesting, and just make sure you have some fun with them. I'd like to thank you for joining me on this tutorial. This was great. If this is something that you're interested in, go ahead and check out my other videos and subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much.